Always trust.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
Svjetski poznat ekonomista i profesor na Univerzitetu Kolumbije u New Yorku bio je poznat po šok terapijama 1990-ih širom istočne Evrope. Savjetovao je predsjednika Mihajla Gorbačova kao i premijera Antu Markovića u tranziciji ka slobodnoj tržišnoj ekonomiji. Sada zagovara Maršalov plan za Ukrajinu, ali smatra da se sa Rusijom mora pregovarati jer u suprotnom prijeti globalna kataklizma.
So Professor Sachs, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera channel, and thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. Now, you recently described the US as the most violent country in the world, and speaking on US governance culture, you referred it to as, quote, a semi-democratic, white-dominated, hierarchical racist society that aims to preserve privilege by the elites. Now, this flutters some feathers around the world. It didn't go too well with many. Was this always your conviction, or have some more recent events impacted your thinking?
Well, first, let me say that those quotations were part of a much longer historical explanation about political cultures around the world. They weren't meant as a characterization of this moment or what's happening at this time, so they should be taken in context. What I said was that after 1950, the United States was engaged in more wars than any other country in the world.
Right.
All my life, the U.S. has been at war, and I think that it is a mistaken foreign policy. That was the point that I was trying to make. This is really the context. Of course, our current situation is we have a war in Ukraine, and it needs to end. It needs to end through cooperation. It needs to end through negotiation, but it needs to end very quickly. That is really the context in which I was speaking a few weeks ago, at which those statements were made.
Right. Why do you say that the war in Ukraine needs to end quickly?
Well, there's so much suffering, so much death. Cities of Ukraine are being pummeled. The people are suffering terribly. And there is, in my opinion, a good chance of a negotiated way out of this. And that's what I would like to see. I would like to see at least that tried. You know, Ukraine deserves its safety, its security, its sovereignty. Russia had drawn a red line many years ago saying, don't expand NATO to Ukraine. I think that that was a major casus belli, a major reason for this war. I would like to revisit that point. And in my view, it was a bad idea to propose NATO enlargement to Ukraine and to Georgia. I think that if the United States and Russia reached an understanding and a modus operandi in which NATO would not enlarge, it would also be possible to find a way to end this war in a way that would respect Ukraine's sovereignty and security as well.
So do you think the US should have respected and taken into consideration Russia's perceived sphere of influence?
Well, I think that Russia had a legitimate reason for saying that a US-led military alliance should not be on its long border with Ukraine. So sphere of influence is one thing. Military bases and alliances and weapons placements and so forth are very much more practical considerations. And I think it was very imprudent of the United States back in 2008 to propose this NATO enlargement deeper into the Black Sea region. After all, Russia's naval fleet in the Black Sea at Sevastopol has been there since 1783. Right. Russia views that region as highly sensitive for national security. And I think big powers should be prudent. They should listen to other powers. It's not, in my view, blackmail or threats, it's prudence. Stay some distance apart so that we don't have these unbelievable tensions between nuclear superpowers.
Right. I mean, the United States insists it will do anything to support Ukraine's defeat of Russia. Russia, on the other hand, views this as a proxy war between itself and the US. So are the US and Russia on a path to a very dangerous escalation?
Of course, the two countries are on a path of escalation, and the war is escalating. And the damage is expanding, the deaths are rising, the destruction of infrastructure is expanding, and we need to get off of this course of escalation. Of course, this is a proxy war to a real extent. The United States is funding this war. It's providing the weaponry. It's providing the intelligence. So that's what a proxy war is. And it's extremely dangerous. What does it mean to defeat Russia, a country with 1,600 deployed nuclear weapons? Even the concept doesn't make sense to me. Now, having a negotiation in which Russia respects Ukraine's sovereignty is important, but the United States should also respect the security interests of Russia, which are real, and they would be real in the US neighborhood, I can assure you. If Russia and Mexico made a security alliance, or China and Mexico made a security alliance, the United States would not just sit there and say, well, that's Mexico's business. This would be fire alarms going off in the United States, and it would be extraordinarily threatening. I mean, once upon a time, Cuba made a military alliance with the Soviet Union. The United States immediately invaded Cuba. So I think great powers need to show prudence. They need to talk with each other. They need to respect red lines of each other. And that, to my mind, is just to keep the world safe.
Right. Professor, given congressional reluctance to spend ever greater sums of money on Ukraine, the broader issue will remain as acute as ever. Should Republicans win the midterms, could Kiev see the flow of US arms and equipment cut off?
I think that there will be much more political debate in the US if the Republicans win one or both houses of Congress in next week's election. This is quite clear. The Republican Party is internally divided on this issue. I think the American people are not at all thrilled with the overall situation. They want to help Ukraine, but on the other hand, they don't want an escalation to Armageddon, as President Biden termed it. They don't want an open checkbook. And the current structure where the US says, well, the war aims are Ukraine's and we support whatever they say, this obviously also doesn't make sense. It's not realistic, especially when one of the major sources of this war is a US decision on NATO. And so in this sense, there has to be US engagement with Russia on actual diplomacy. And I think the pressures for that will grow. And if the Republicans win in some part or both houses of Congress next week, my guess is that this will at least open up the debate in the United States much more than it has been. Up until now, basically, it's been an open checkbook. But I think that a lot of people are taking a second look at this. Where did this war come from? How can it stop? Is this really in Ukraine's interest, by the way? Because what I'm saying, in my own view, is Ukraine's interest. I don't want to see Ukraine destroyed by a proxy war. I think Ukraine's actually in the middle of this war between Russia and the US for influence in Eurasia, for military posture in Eurasia. Ukraine's in a very uncomfortable situation. Many Ukrainian friends object to my view, but I'm terribly upset and concerned about all of the destruction and death that's taking place and the risks of escalation that are occurring.
Right. Professor, with rather warm weather in Europe these days, do you think European states can survive this winter without Russian gas? And can Russia redirect its gas and oil exports towards China, perhaps India?
Well, yes, Europe will survive, but definitely the European economies are already being hit. My guess is that Europe is already in a contraction or a downturn. Certainly the inflation, which topped 10% in the most recent reading, is the highest in many decades. Europe is feeling a lot of pain, and as the temperatures get colder, so the demands for heating increase, the pain will also increase. Will Europe survive? Absolutely, it will survive. Will there be economic hardship from this? Yes. And the idea of negotiating a peace is actually to stop pain that is avoidable. The pain is great. It could get greater. The risks are very high. This confrontation is extremely dangerous. There's lots of subterfuge and escalatory steps. The UK, according to Russia, was part of an attack on the Black Sea Fleet a few days ago. There have been all sorts of events that are extremely dangerous. It's reported today that the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant has been cut off from the grid. I don't know whether that's true today, but what I do know is that the shelling of that plant, most likely by Ukraine, which is trying to retake the plant, is extremely dangerous for everybody. So we need to get the parties back to the negotiating table, not just Ukraine and Russia, because that actually is not even necessarily the main point. It's the US and Russia, which need to talk about security arrangements and red lines in a much more serious way. But that is for the sake of everybody, for safety, for economy, for getting out of this mess before we have unlimited disaster.
Right, Professor, going back to Europe's economy, why is Europe's economy getting hammered these days? Is it because of the sudden cutoff in Russian oil and gas? Why are we seeing a decline in a sharp decline in output, a sharp decline in living standards, and rising costs? Or are we still feeling the repercussions of the COVID-19 pandemic?
This is mainly the result of the war and the sanctions regime and the cutoff of energy. It's what we call an adverse supply shock. And I studied this already 40 years ago because in the 1970s, there was the Arab oil embargo against the Western countries after the 1973 war in the Middle East. And that led to a sharp downturn and higher inflation throughout Europe and the United States, what we call stagflation. I wrote my PhD dissertation on that topic back in 1980. This is what we're seeing again in Europe. Europe is being hard hit by a sudden cutoff of energy. Is it devastating for Europe? No. Is it painful for Europe? Absolutely, yes. It's a lot of economic pain. It's a reduction of living standards. It's a hit to European industry. This was made worse by the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline, which I assume, just based on circumstantial evidence.
That was exactly my next question.
Yep.
A lot of money was invested in, and a lot of time and money was invested in constructing the Nord Stream pipeline, which is out of operation now. Who do you think was responsible for sabotaging it?
I think most independent, knowledgeable observers believe that this was probably a US, UK operation. It's the kind of thing the US does when it's facing an adversary, is destroy infrastructure. It's done that on many occasions. What we say, in forensic evidence is the motive, the means, and the opportunity. And I think the US and the UK had all three of them. The finger pointing to Russia doesn't make much sense. This was Russian infrastructure that was key for Russia-European economic ties, which Russia hopes will someday be restored. So I don't think that Russia bombed its own infrastructure. We don't know for sure, but when a president of the United States says in February, I think it was February 7th, President Biden said, when asked by a reporter, he said, if Russia invades Ukraine, there will be no more Nord Stream. The reporter was quite puzzled and said, Mr. President, this is a German-Russian piece of infrastructure. How can you say that? And he said, paraphrasing, we have our ways. And I think that this was quite telling in my view. It's the motive part. After the event, the U.S. Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, said in a press conference that he had with the Canadian foreign minister that this was a tremendous opportunity to wean Europe away from Russian energy. So I found it a strange statement to make in the wake of some kind of illegal terrorist attack on international infrastructure. I would not have called it a tremendous opportunity. So I think that also the mere fact that Sweden has said, well, we've looked at it, but we're not going to tell anybody what we found, not even Germany and Denmark. You have to wonder what's going on. Where's our transparency? And we are democracies in the US and Europe, and citizens need to understand all of this. So let's see what the evidence is.
Right. Now, moving on very briefly towards Turkey. Since the start of Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February this year, Turkey has remained one of the friendliest of all NATO countries towards Moscow. It has not imposed sanctions. It has not cut off flights towards Moscow. And it has continued to cooperate closely with Kiev as well. What are your views of Turkey's balancing act between NATO, Moscow, and Kiev?
I think Turkey has been extremely smart, extremely agile, and extremely helpful because Turkey has aimed to serve as a mediator of this conflict. Remember, Turkish diplomacy goes back hundreds of years. It's very skilled. This is Turkey's immediate neighborhood, the Black Sea. A lot of the issues are about the Black Sea security. So I really admire Turkey's role in this, in trying to mediate between the parties and trying to find a peaceful resolution. And I think Turkey's done a great job against many obstacles.
President Vladimir Putin has been in power for more than 20 years. In order to survive, he had to tame ambitious generals, ambitious intelligence chiefs, and so he's clearly a very strategic and rational thinker. Has the West perhaps underestimated Vladimir Putin?
I think the big mistake was not to negotiate directly between the US and Russia for many, many years. And when President Biden came in, that was an opportunity for direct negotiations. We say many things about Russia, by the way. For example, it's often said in our press, you can't trust Russia. They intervened in Syria. And it's true in 2014, 2015. But the United States intervened in Syria years before that, secretly, covertly, in a very destabilizing way. So to my mind, there is absolutely means for negotiations, for understanding each other, for listening to red lines, for US leaders thinking, well, if we were in Russia's position, how would we feel about X, Y, and Z? And I think if we had more of that, and by the way, also true of US relations with China, we'd have a much safer world.
Mm-hmm. There's been a deafening silence from Western educated technocrats who are in charge of running Russia's economy. How skilled are they, and how long can Russia's economy survive these sanctions, and how long is it before Russia depletes its foreign and gold reserves?
You know, we can't tell everything that's going on, certainly, but I think the idea that the US and European Union had about what and UK had about what the sanctions would accomplish was way overblown. They even called cutting Russia out from SWIFT the nuclear option at the time. Boy, a real nuclear option is quite different from that. And these sanctions do not have the weight that is assumed by the West. The point is there's a big world market. Russia trades with the Middle East. It trades with India. It trades with China, trades with Latin America. Most of the world trades with Africa. Most of the world did not sign on to the Western sanctions. And so Russia remains in economic trade with a lot of the world. Commodities, especially oil, is very fungible. Gas, not so much, because you need infrastructure for the gas, but Russia is actually aiming to build pipelines, and that's quite plausible for making sure that Russian gas can be sold in Asia. Mm-hmm. What is on the surface happening is that Russia's saying, well, if the West cuts off all our relations, we will look to China, to India, to Africa, to Latin America for our economic relations. I think it would be, and then the world would be divided into these camps. This would be a very sad and dangerous outcome. It's the direction we're going right now, if not worse. I would like to see this splitting of the world into separate camps to end. We don't really want another period of intense political, geopolitical conflict in this way, and we should try to take the off-ramp so that the world economy doesn't split in this way.
Now, back in the 1990s, you were known as the shock therapist for your, advising various communist governments in Eastern Europe, including Yugoslavia, in the transition to a free market economy. Looking at things from today's perspective, how successful have former communist countries been in their rather painful transition to free market economies, and why have privatization efforts led to the collapse of huge companies, huge factories in parts of former Yugoslavia, parts of Eastern Europe? And then there are huge differences between the transition of Baltic countries, which have been very successful, and those, for example, in the Balkans.
Well, there's a lot of geopolitics that is involved in this, and this I've written about quite extensively. Countries that were accepted into the Western fold quickly, a country like Poland, where I advised, or the Baltic states, which received financial assistance from the West, open arms and open markets, did quite well. Countries where there was a barrier or you're on the other side of the divide did much worse. And of course, in the former Soviet Union and former Yugoslavia, the breakup of those states was a calamitous economic event because it destroyed financial, trade, division of labor factors that went back many decades, and it was quite sudden. When I advised all of these countries, my main advice was to the West. It was to the United States and Europe. Provide financial backing so that there isn't an economic crisis. When I suggested that for Poland, my advice was heeded. When I suggested that for Yugoslavia as advisor to Prime Minister Ante Markovic, the Europeans and US said, no, we're not going to help federal Yugoslavia. Well, we know what happened. It broke to pieces. Whether that was inevitable or not is another matter, but my advice was not heeded. And then I was advisor to the economic team of President Gorbachev and then President Yeltsin, and actually also President Kuchma in Ukraine. On all three occasions, I urged the Western world, help these countries. The financial crisis is very severe. The collapse of the former command economy is devastating. Help. But they didn't want to help because that was the enemy. You know, now it was going to be a US unipolar world. So there was no financial help coming. They didn't give financial help to Gorbachev. They didn't give financial help to Yeltsin. It created, it didn't create the mess. It just made it so difficult to address what was a tremendously deep and intense economic crisis. So I resigned because my hope, my expertise was bring help for these countries. But the help came only on geopolitical terms. If you're on our side of the divide, we help you. If you're on the other side of the divide, we don't help you. And that has shaped a great deal of what happened. Also, by the way, just to be clear, geography also matters. If you're right next door to Germany, as Poland is, or the Central European countries, you have a big advantage. That's where foreign investment goes. If you're in the Balkans, you're farther away. If you're behind the former Soviet border, then you're much farther away, both geographically and geopolitically. And that has made a very big difference.
And finally, Professor, I mean, after World War II, the U.S. helped Yugoslavia a lot through the Marshall Fund, and they helped. There was a similar program for Germany as well. Some people have been calling for a similar program to be applied to Ukraine to help its post-war reconstruction. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I called for that in 1990. I called for that in 1991. I called for that in 1992. It's not just Ukraine. We should be helping with broad economic transformation, also the Western Balkans, also Russia. Let's not make a new absolute divide of pain and misery for the next decades. There's no reason for that. We should be making a world that lives together. And if we talk to each other, we'd actually understand the roots of some of these conflicts a lot more than we do.
Right. Professor Jeffrey Sachs, it was a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Great to be with you. Thank you. Appreciate it.